Hello everyone, and welcome to the sort of Christmas special of the Riley Hall Show, which is a thing that we decided to do, even though the content won't actually have anything to do with Christmas. And today we thought we'd do a tier list. I thought I'd just do a tier list. Everyone likes those tier list maker videos, right? So today we are doing a tier list of British Prime Ministers. More specifically, UK Prime Ministers since World War One. I think with the exception of one guy, Bonar Law. I don't know if... Oh no, he is there. He's there. Sort of chilling out in the corner. So we're going to be ranking them, and my opinions are better than yours, so you should listen very intently, very carefully. So without further ado, let's just go. And we're ranking them on, in terms of their effect on British society, their competence, how transparent they were, how truthful they were, if they improved living standards, if they improved how democratic the country was, if they improved Britain's standing on the world stage, all kinds of different things. So this is going to be a comprehensive tier list. Start off with the bottom. I think that only makes sense. G tier, the worst of the worst, the sort of burn in hell category, as you might call it. And I think it makes just so much sense to start with this wonderful woman here, Margaret Maggie Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher is the worst. Just generally, I think. I mean, does anyone who likes her, usually when I ask them, all the reasons they give are actually just wrong, like factually wrong, like not like a kind of like, oh well, that's your opinion, like factual, like they say that she was great for economic growth, but during her premiership there were at least 2 recessions, right? There were at least 2. I mean, I think there were probably 3. But we all know Maggie. She. Obviously there was massive turmoil, really high levels of unemployment during a lot of her premiership, but that barely scratches the surface. So she came into power in 1979, saying that we needed to take a course of action that was very different to the previous sort of 35 years. She believed that the reason that Britain was struggling economically and we just had the winter of discontent and things like that was because actually, creeping socialism was causing our country to become less and less dynamic, less and less efficient, and too soft, right? We needed to toughen up. And so she came in and she did some stuff. Thatcher privatised most of the or at least a lot of the key industries, She privatised all sorts of stuff like the railways, and she privatised the water companies, I believe, and the energy companies. She privatised Jaguar. She privatised British Steel, I think, as well. There was a lot of stuff going on, and she did not like any of it being publicly owned, so she privatised all of it for less than they were worth, I might add. She didn't even privatise them well. She was that desperate to get them out, to sell them off to private companies, so they were owned by a handful of shareholders rather than by the public sort of collectively who could democratically change it. Now, obviously that isn't always in practice how it works when something's been nationalised, but that it is how it should be and how it can be. But Maggie didn't like that. She also, as you all know, crippled the unions. She absolutely destroyed the unions, passed horrendous anti-trade union legislation. Instead of creating a fairer and genuinely more democratic economy, she went the other way, and just decided that actually if we just force the working class to just shut up, then we'll be fine. So she did that, and then also there was all kinds of other things, like she went to war in the Falklands probably to win an election, because Labour were probably going to win that election. I want to actually see that, because I'm pretty sure the polling is pretty decisive. Polling, UK election 1983, because I think Labour were actually really far ahead just before the Falkland War. Yeah, see, so Labour were probably going to win that election, and she was like, nah. We got to go to war. And then, of course, there was the split with the SDP Liberal Alliance and stuff. And those guys are the worst. But, well, they're not actually the worst. Maggie's the worst, obviously. But, you know, she went to war. I mean, you know, the Falkland War was caused by Argentinian aggression, so fair enough, right? But, yeah. What else? There were so many terrible things. Section 28, you know, outlawing the teaching of stuff that even remotely acknowledges the existence of homosexuality in a neutral or positive light. You know, you couldn't talk about people being gay, you couldn't talk about people being trans, you couldn't talk about any of that in schools. If that was taught by teachers, then, you know, criminal. That was criminal, essentially. And she was very homophobic. So she kind of screwed us over in a big way. And a lot of the deregulation of the financial sector, the deregulation of the housing market, and selling off loads of Britain's council houses, but they're not building more to kind of replenish that stock, laid the groundwork for the financial crisis of 2008. So that whole neoliberal cesspool of shit is Maggie. So we're putting her at the very bottom. God, this is going to take ages if I talk this much about every Prime Minister, but luckily I don't know all that much about all of them to the level of Maggie. Next up, I mean, I think we just have to say Ted Heath. That is Ted Heath, right? I'm going to assume that's Ted Heath, and if it's not, I apologise. Ted Heath was really crap as well, really, really shit. I'm pretty sure he oversaw like 3-day weeks because of all the strikes, and there was like rats in the streets and like overflowing bins and stuff. He was crap. But he didn't even have the balls to at least be like overtly, obviously and proudly evil like Margaret Thatcher. He was just crap. So he's down there. And then I think the only other person that really goes all the way at that very bottom level, because there's quite a few levels here, is Neville Chamberlain. Because this motherfucker genuinely thought that you could get a peace treaty with Hitler. That you could like have a peace that would actually be beneficial to Britain with the fascist powers, with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. He was an idiot, he was a terrible statesman, his foreign policy was horrendous, and if he'd stayed Prime Minister, then the world would be a much worse place. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the sort of conservative elites in Britain realised their lives wouldn't get that much worse, really, if the Nazis had lots of influence over Britain. You know, wouldn't really affect them. It would affect working class people, would affect disabled people and Jewish people and black people. It would affect gay people, and women obviously. But it wasn't a big deal for the sort of elites like Chamberlain himself. But that's no excuse, because Churchill still stood up to them, but whatever. So in the next tier, on the next level, it's F, right? Now these are guys who, I mean, I guess it's just like get in the bin. Like, they're crap, but they're not like the worst humans in history. So I'd say that these guys, it can be incompetence that can cause them to be in here, but it can also just be that they are pretty nasty. I think we've got to put Boris Johnson in F tier, because he has been pretty catastrophic. I genuinely did want to give him the benefit of the doubt, as much as I thought he was going to be terrible. I wanted him to pleasantly surprise me, but he did not. And he's totally degraded the office of Prime Minister, and he's had a corruption scandal like every other day in his government. He was partying with his mates during the lockdown of winter 2020, while everyone else was terrified to see their loved ones and was staying at home. And he's broken the law. Not to mention how his government has been talking the talk about like taking real action on climate change. They haven't done that, really. And they've, said that they're rising the national insurance contributions working class people are going to have to make. They have a social care plan that is absolutely terrible, doesn't address the core problems. They're gradually privatising the NHS. And the guy just lies all the time, just so much. He doesn't shut up. And the way he's handled the coronavirus pandemic has been terrible. You know, we have the highest death toll in Europe. We have one of the highest death rates per million on the planet. And it's disgusting, really. We're a developed country. And even if you compare us to countries with higher populations and higher population density, like Japan or Vietnam, we do a lot worse, even when you compare it to those countries. So it's not like it's just New Zealand and Norway or something, right? So there's a lot of countries. So he's absolutely horrendous, really, Boris Johnson. Get in the bin, please. So next up, I think also in F tier, we have to have Anthony Eden. I'm pretty sure Anthony Eden was Prime Minister during the Suez crisis, or Suez, or however you pronounce it. And he was a bit dreadful. He didn't last very long, which kind of usually gives an indication of ability. And I mean, he was a Tory, so usually that means not great. But, I'm trying to be unbiased here when it comes to that. But, I value stuff like lifting people out of poverty with, social programs and, public ownership of essential utilities and strengthening sort of democracy in politics and economics, like cooperatives and things like that. So I'm bound to be more harsh on Tories because they just don't ever do that kind of thing, really. But I mean, occasionally they do. But yeah, Anthony Eden was pretty garbage, and unfortunately, I think we'll have to put Jim in there, Jim Callahan. Just not a particularly good Prime Minister at all. It was thanks to a lot of the stuff he did that Thatcher was managed to get in. He kind of legitimised reductions in spending, privatisation, suppressing wages to try and get the economy back going again. So instead of kind of arguing from the point of, well, actually, when you improve the lives of working class people and you empower working class people and distribute resources more evenly, more fairly, that's actually better for the economy. That gets us back on track. Instead, he kind of fell into this trap of, actually, we can only do that when the economy is strong, right? That's not a way of making it strong. That's just a lovely byproduct that can occur when it already is strong, and you can't really have it when it isn't, right? Which is still kind of a thing to this day. And New Labour really kind of leaned into that, but he kind of allowed Thatcher to get into that. He didn't deal with the winter of discontent very well at all. I don't think he had bad intentions, I just think he was a very poor statesman. So unfortunately, Jim Callahan goes there. Next, I think in E tier, we're going to put Bonar Law and Sir Alec Douglas-Home, because they were just kind of nothing prime ministers. They weren't in office very long at all, and I don't really think they had much time to do much. If anyone knows more about them, please do say something in the comments, because I'd like to learn more. But yeah, I was very much joking about my opinion. I actually don't know loads about this, but I'm talking about it anyway, because isn't that the beauty of the internet? You can have an opinion and broadcast it to the world, even if it's horrendously uninformed. So here we are. So also in E, I think we'd probably have to put Theresa May in there. Theresa was, bless her, I mean, she was a horrendous Home Secretary responsible for the hostile environment where various people of Afro-Caribbean descent who had lived in Britain for many, many years, some of whom were even legally citizens, were either harassed by authorities, detained, or even deported from their home, from the UK. But we're just talking about what they did as Prime Minister. And as Prime Minister, obviously, her premiership was dominated by Brexit. She called that election thinking she was going to get a landslide, and then Jeremy Corbyn pulled it out of the bag and very nearly won himself. Probably would have if it wasn't for deliberate sabotage within the Labour Party by a lot of right-wing Labour MPs, but that's a story for another time. And she handled the negotiations very badly, but then again, you could argue that was a lot to do with the rest of the Tory party, who had these absolutely ridiculous red lines. And Boris Johnson didn't change the deal that much, but a lot of the Tories who are like hardline Brexiteers got on board with his deal rather than Theresa May's. So, that's why she's not lower down on the list. Big Terry May. I almost feel sorry for her. Almost. But I don't. Because she deported British citizens based on race. So she can sod off. So, now, I think we can move on to D tier. I mean, these guys aren't the worst. They're not terrible, but they're just kind of mediocre. And C tier is like that as well, but they're like erring on the better side. So I think we'd put John Major there. Now, John Major, I do think, was a bad Prime Minister, but I think he sort of had his heart in the right place a bit. Maybe. I don't know. He was kind of the human face of Thatcherism, wasn't he? That's what they call him. And yes, he was incompetent, but actually the economy was doing all right when New Labour took office. It was just like, at that point, the damage had kind of been done, and Labour had obviously pivoted so far away from kind of state socialism kind of stuff that the British people, I think, were ready for a change at that point, especially when the Sun got on board and backed Tony Blair, because Rupert Murdoch was feeling like a change, so he just thought he'd change the course of British history, because he can do that, because that's the kind of power he has. Isn't that fun? So Major, I don't think was terrible, but certainly not a good Prime Minister. Who next, man? I don't know. I mean, alright, I mean Stanley Baldwin, that's his name? I think that's his name. I think that's his name. Stanley Baldwin was alright. I mean, he was a bit crap, but he was Prime Minister at different points in the interwar period, and he wasn't great, but I think he kind of steadied the ship a little bit of the country. But I think he also passed some anti-trade union legislation. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah. But you don't really hear about him, which is interesting, considering he was Prime Minister during quite an important period. Next, I think I'd probably put David Cameron in there, in D. Now, David Cameron was a terrible Prime Minister. He was. And for that reason, I'm actually changing my mind. I'm putting him in E. David Cameron was terrible, yeah, I've changed my mind. He should go in E. I mean, austerity killed over 100,000 people. I think the estimate is about 130,000 people from 2010 to 2019. And he was the chief sort of driver of that. He and George Osborne, and we shouldn't let George Osborne off the hook. He's got a very, very cushy job now, or at least probably a few very cushy jobs, as does David Cameron. But David Cameron, of course, was Prime Minister. He was the guy in charge. He should have been the one who said, no, we're not going to do this. And it didn't improve the UK economy. You know, we had the worst decade of wage growth since the Napoleonic War. So the guy is an idiot, incredibly cruel. He said his regrets about austerity were that they didn't do it harder and faster. Maybe he was mistaking that for his encounter with that pig many years ago, I don't know. But he also, of course, called the EU referendum, because he was like, these stupid plebs, they're not going to vote to leave. That would be like thicker than pig shit. And of course, he was an expert on all things swine related. The British people, never underestimate their ability to say, I know it's not really in my best interest, but you're telling me to do it and I don't like you, so... So, David Cameron, terrible PM, yeah. Not very good at all. Then we've got, but he did support legalising gay marriage. So that was good. But if it wasn't for Labour and the Lib Dems, it would have never passed, because like over half of the Tory MPs in Parliament voted against it. But to his credit, he was one of the people who supported that. So Also, yeah, let's go back to sort of D-level. I think, to be honest, I think we've got to put Ramsay MacDonald in there. As much as, you know, it was great that he was the first Prime Minister, Labour Prime Minister, he also eventually abandoned Labour in favour of a national sort of unity government during the sort of interwar years, and his government didn't do an awful lot of what the Labour Party should be doing, which is, you know, bringing the means of production into collective ownership, you know, turning private companies into cooperative companies. You know, they should have been, you know, nationalising key industries. They should have been, you know, expanding the franchise more. They should have been, you know, making sure healthcare and good wages, you know, food, clean water and shelter was available to as many people as possible. To his credit, there was a big house building project at that point, and lots of people got homes who otherwise wouldn't have. So that was good, but he kind of failed to really resist the urges of anyone who gets into power to sort of slink back into the status quo and accept the kind of conventional wisdom of the time. And the conventional wisdom of the time was this quite laissez-faire style of running a country's economy, which, as we know, doesn't work. And the US obviously pursued the New Deal, which was one of the things that allowed them to become such a prosperous country after the 30s. So I think C tier is where we should go next. I think, you know, Harold Macmillan, I think he should go there. Now, Harold Macmillan was not a good man. I'm not a fan. As far as Tory Prime Ministers go, I don't think he was terrible. He resisted the urge to tear down the Keynesian consensus. You know, he was a Conservative who actually criticised Thatcherism and the neoliberal model. And for that, I think he just has to go into the C tier. But, you know, yeah, he certainly wasn't particularly great. And he was involved in the cabinet when the Suez crisis happened, I believe. We'll put him in C tier. I think that's a good idea. It's actually getting quite difficult now. We're gonna have to address the elephant in the room. Tony Blair is an interesting man, isn't he? Because he's a war criminal. That's quite uncontroversial, I think. Because, I mean, Tony Blair, he led the UK into the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and that invasion was illegal. So he's a war criminal. And he was one of the people who was really pushing for the Iraq war, despite the fact that he was warned by a lot of people, including French President Jacques Chirac, to not pursue the war and to not take America's word for it. He went for it anyway, and hundreds of thousands of people, most of whom were innocent civilians, died in Iraq. And of course, some British service people died as well. So you can't ignore that with Blair. So you would imagine that that would place him in G or F tier, right? He's either like burn in hell or get in the bin. But weirdly, his foreign policy was actually quite good prior to the Iraq war. Now, yes, the Afghan invasion was probably a bit ill-advised and they should have had a much better strategy for nation building, but the Taliban were harbouring Al-Qaeda, so that kind of makes sense. But you go before that, and there's actually some decent foreign policy triumphs, because you have stuff like, you know, intervention in Kosovo, which was one of the ways that we ended like this horrendous conflict that was devolving into incidents of, you know, severe ethnic cleansing, and the same in Sierra Leone in 2000. So there's that, and then there's the domestic policy. Now, later on in his premiership, the last sort of 2 or 3 years, Tony Blair pursued quite an authoritarian domestic policy, mainly focused on security measures and things like laws to try and detain people with zero evidence for many weeks. And he ended up getting those passed, but like slightly more sort of slimmed down versions of that. But that was pretty horrendous. But if you look at the earlier stuff, you had the implementation of the minimum wage, you had the Human Rights Act, you have devolution in Scotland and Wales, you have legislation like you have the creation of the Food Standards Agency, which was actually quite a brilliant achievement that a lot of people overlook. Massive investments in the NHS and in education, and kids were doing better in school, there's no doubt about that. And NHS waiting times got to the lowest in history. And by 2000, I think it was 2001, it could have been 2005, but like at some point during his premiership, the drinking water, the air and the quality of the soil and the food we were eating was the best it had been since before the Industrial Revolution. So that's really good. So he's an enigma, Tony Blair. I really don't know where to put him. There's one thing that you just can't ignore about the new Labour years, and that is that 1 million pensioners and 500,000 young people / children were lifted out of poverty. 1.5 million human beings lifted out of poverty. And for me, that means that he can't be any lower than C. He's a war criminal. I know it's weird. Oh man, I'm so tempted to put him way further down. I don't know. This is annoying me a lot. Because he did some unspeakable things. I'm going to say C, because I just think that, the domestic policies helped the lives of so many people. And Sure Start as well. I forgot about Sure Start. I think it has to be there. Also in C, I think we're going to put Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown, I think, is actually an underrated Prime Minister. I think he definitely deserved a second term. He dealt with the financial crisis pretty well. Without him, there would have been a much worse global recession, and who knows what would have happened to the UK economy. He was a global leader. He really was in dealing with that. He was probably one of the best chancellors we've ever had. He was the longest serving Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I do think that it was a shame he didn't get a second term. But he shouldn't have bailed out the banks. He should have let some of them fail. And he should have made sure that everyone had the savings required. That everyone whose savings had been lost was compensated through either government borrowing or increases in taxation on the ultra wealthy, or like hedge funds, or even somehow the banks, if you could manage that. And even if you say you had to bail them out, which you definitely didn't, but even if you had to, should have been far better regulation to stop people from giving themselves lovely bonuses. And there should have been way more regulation implemented, way more. So for that reason, he doesn't get any higher. But I do think that he was a good Prime Minister. I think he had good intentions. It's a shame, I think, that he didn't get a second term. B, we're putting the absolute boy, Harold Wilson. Harold was pretty great. I think the stuff with his economic policy never really manifested into something that was hugely successful or useful. He didn't implement policies that increased collective ownership. He didn't implement policies that increased prosperity on a significant scale. But the economy was doing all right while he was Prime Minister, so you have to remember that. But it's in foreign policy and sort of the more social policy areas where Harold Wilson really shines. He implemented all kinds of great laws. His government passed a lot of legislation that made it easier for women to get divorced. It empowered women. They did things like decriminalising homosexuality and liberalising abortion law, I think, as well. So he was pretty great in that regard. And also in foreign policy, he kept us out of the Vietnam War, which, if a certain Tony had done, might have meant that he'd got in B tier as well. But yeah, so I think Harold Wilson definitely deserves to be in at least B. He was a pretty cool guy. The most feminist Prime Minister, really. He improved women's rights the most out of any Prime Minister. Certainly in the post-war period. Next, I think we've got to have David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George was Prime Minister from, I think it was 1916 to 1922, I want to say. His government had like a lot of flaws, but it did some absolutely fantastic things to the point where you can't really ignore it. I've actually got his Wikipedia up here. So there was like lots and lots of great house building programs, right? So like the Housing and Town Planning Act 1919, 170,000 dwellings were built under it by the end of 1922. Further 30,000 homes and all this stuff. Then you had, he even tried to implement like proper rent controls through the Rent Act 1920, and that was sick, man. I mean, it didn't work, but you know, good, thanks for trying. His foreign policy wasn't great. I mean, yes, it was obviously great that the war ended when he was Prime Minister, and that, you know, Germany didn't create a huge empire spanning across Europe and various other places in the developing world. But he was pretty sort of anti-German when it came to the Treaty of Versailles and stuff, and the Paris Peace Conference should have gone in a different direction, really, and he was one of the reasons it didn't go in the right direction. To be fair, George Clemenceau is more to blame for that than David Lloyd George, but yeah. He also implemented legislation like the Representation of the People Act, which meant that the franchise for men was greatly extended by abolishing most property qualifications, and it gave the vote to many women over 30. And there was another act that enabled women to sit in the House of Commons, and then later on, there was more stuff like that. There was Unemployment Insurance Act, which extended national insurance to 11 million additional workers, considered to be a revolutionary measure. You know, it was almost the entire labour force, man, and you know, farm labourers receive a minimum wage. Stuff like providing social welfare opportunities to mining communities, created the Ministry of Health, you know, increased insurance benefits and eligibility for pensions was extended to more people. There was a lot of great stuff in there. He kind of created the basis for the modern welfare state and made society a lot more humane. Granted, it still wasn't nearly good enough, but there was a lot of progress, and I think for that he definitely has to go in B tier. So now we have the final two, right? We have arguably the two greatest prime ministers we ever had. Now, I want to say I'm judging Churchill based on his abilities as a war leader, and I think we can all agree that a lot of the stuff he did in World War II, his leadership was pretty essential, and that he wasn't really a Tory Prime Minister. He led a sort of national unity government, and Clement Atlee was Deputy Prime Minister in that, and he was basically the only Tory that Labour were comfortable leading a national government, because they knew that he would resist Nazi aggression. Churchill was horrendously racist, I know that. And I know he did horrible things, but his leadership against the Axis powers, I think, it just has to put him very high on this list. And I think most British people would probably agree with that. His second term though, when he was re-elected in 1951, and he shouldn't have been as well. My boy Clement was robbed. He was robbed. When he was re-elected then, even though the Tories actually lost the popular vote to Labour, they won more seats because of the horrendous electoral system called first past the post that we still have. He was terrible, right? He was way past his sell-by date, basically, and the Tories forced him to resign, and then he was replaced by Anthony Eden. So they kind of went out of the frying pan and into the shit with that one. But all in all, I think it's very important to recognise the contribution Churchill made to the preservation of democracy in the West, and in Britain in particular. It's just the fact that his resistance to the Nazis and the Italian fascists was so strong that we actually managed to not sign for peace, which is what most of the other high up Tories wanted us to do at the time. So Churchill, I think, has to go in A tier. And as much as that pains me, because the guy's personal views were horrible and some of his actions, like causing the Bengal famine, were absolutely despicable, I think that the consequences of him not being Prime Minister at that time, and any other Conservative being Prime Minister, and indeed some of Labour's MPs, would have been catastrophic, even more so because the Nazis would have probably taken hold in Britain in some way or another. You all know now, obviously, who's getting S tier, who is the absolute GOAT, the best Prime Minister we have ever had, and that title of course goes to Clement Atlee. I don't know, man, what can we say about Clement Atlee that hasn't already been said? He was fantastic. Not without his flaws, of course. He was human. Clement Atlee is the best Prime Minister the UK has ever had, and potentially ever will have. He implemented really, really tremendous reforms. He won a landslide majority in 1945, promising to win the peace. That's what he said. The Labour campaign was, we've won the war, now let's win the peace. Labour implemented this little thing called the National Health Service. Without that government, without Clement Atlee, we probably wouldn't have the NHS. He oversaw that, but he also oversaw so many other things. There was the establishment of a huge house building programme. Loads of houses were built to try and house the nation's people. Several key industries were nationalised, and the profits were used to invest in social uplift programmes. There was some socially progressive legislation implemented, I think, as well, to give women more rights. His government was responsible for, if David Lloyd George's government created the foundations of the modern welfare state, Clement Attlee's constructed the rest of the house and made it incredibly strong. Without a doubt, his government is responsible for the greatest anti-poverty initiatives in British history. There are so many things that he did that, it goes without saying that he must be the best Prime Minister we had. And trade unions, working people finally had, a much better shot at life. They had a lot more representation. They were now able to, form trade unions more easily. And what we saw under Atlee was the beginning of the greatest period of prosperity in British history. That sort of 1945 through to 1976 kind of period was brilliant in terms of progress, socially, economically. Again, though, there were issues. There were issues, of course, and his foreign policy especially wasn't great. It was pretty amazing that the government did things that just improved the lives of just so many ordinary people. Investments in public services, in social welfare programs, strengthening trade unions, making sure that everyone had access to healthcare free at the point of service, paid for through taxation. It was pretty incredible stuff. For that reason, Clement Atlee is at the very top of our list in the S tier. So, that took ages, but I'm glad we took our time. I really enjoyed that. That is every Prime Minister in the UK since 1916. So I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are. If you want, my Twitter will be appearing on the screen at some point, and you can tweet me with your tier list, because I'm really genuinely interested to see what your picks are. I know some people will probably be very mad with some of the choices, and I apologise, but that's just kind of what I think. Thank you all very much for watching, I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas. Thank you very much. This has been the Riley Hall Show Christmas special. The British Prime Minister tier list. Let's just hope that one day soon we'll get another Clement Atlee instead of another Boris Johnson.